Okay? All right, the fans are very loud, so I'll try to talk loud, but you can't talk or there's no way I'm going to be able to be loud. The subject of this Afterlab is abolish ICE, the hashtag / political movement / debate argument, or how it might play out in debates this year. I'm going to give you some background about abolish ICE, what that means, why I think it's important for you to learn about that. I'm going to suggest some readings. I'm going to kind of walk you through some of the history that is important for you to know, and I'm just going to give you some tips and basic principles for how to debate this as an argument. We're all talking. Should I just go home? I should just go home? Okay, I should keep going? All right, I will only keep going if people are listening. How many of you are familiar with hashtag abolish ICE? You've heard of that before. How many of you are on Twitter or Facebook? How many of you are on either? Interesting. Okay, I'm always curious about that. So at the top of this document, I've got a bunch of recommended readings. All of these are things that didn't get cut and put into the file, the first version of the file. There'll be an additional version of the file. So I'm going to start with the second subheading called the history of abolish ICE. And the first thing that you have to understand is the history of ICE and what ICE is. So ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and it is a sub-agency of the Department of Homeland Security. Who in here was born in 2003 or after? A lot of you? Okay. ICE has only existed since 2002, 2003, which I don't think a lot of people know. ICE is something that was created after 9/11 in the Homeland Security Act, which also created the Department of Homeland Security. So for most of you, the Department of Homeland Security has existed for all of your lives, or maybe from the time you were 1 or 2 years old. But it's a relatively new thing, historically, in the kind of larger U.S. context. So the Department of Homeland Security is created. A bunch of sub-agencies are moved under the Department of Homeland Security. The primary motivation is obviously preventing another September 11th, preventing domestic terrorism, preventing threats to the U.S. homeland. That's why it's called the Homeland Security Department. Controversial at the time, although there was a lot of political momentum to do something and to restructure the government. A lot of blame was being thrown around about why didn't different agencies see 9/11 coming, why didn't they stop it, what was the problem, was it lack of agency coordination, was it too much bureaucracy, was it understaffed agencies, a lot of different answers, a lot of reports and studies went into figuring out the answer. But the George W. Bush administration pushed through the Homeland Security Act, creating the Department of Homeland Security, and within that created this new agency called ICE, which is in charge of interior immigration enforcement. And the key word is interior. So that means people who are already in the United States are the target, or the thing that ICE is targeting. So ICE's job is to enforce immigration laws on people who are in the United States. Border Patrol was also created and housed under the Department of Homeland Security, and it patrols the border. So I think there's a common misconception that ICE is ICE agents are sitting at the border and watching for people to come across, and they're detaining people and sending them away. That is not ICE's job. That is the Border Patrol's job. The interesting thing, or sort of the reason that this is important, is that before the Homeland Security Act was created, there was no agency tasked with interior immigration enforcement. There was no interior immigration enforcement as such. There was a Border Patrol, there was visa processing, there were green cards, there was a flow of legal immigration, and there were ways to become legal when you were entering the United States, but there was no police agency that was solely responsible for patrolling the inside of the country and finding and deporting immigrants who were undocumented. There are two parts of ICE. There is the ERO, which is the enforcement and removal operations. That's what you think of when you think of ICE. Those are the agents that do raids and do deportation. So they find undocumented people, they arrest them, and they process them for deportation. And then there's HSI, which is Homeland Security Investigations. That's the other wing of ICE. And that does law enforcement investigations related to transnational crime. So a lot of trafficking-related things, drug trafficking, human trafficking, weapons trafficking, that kind of thing, as well as other criminal enterprises that cross international boundaries. And they're kind of unique role within that is to deal with the domestic immigration component, but they work with law enforcement agencies from across the country and from throughout the world. The weird thing about that is that we already have lots of law enforcement agencies that do that. We have the FBI, we have the Joint Terrorism Task Force, we have the ATF, we have the DEA, we have local police, we have sheriff's departments. We have a lot of law enforcement already, and so ICE was created to fulfill a new role, and then it actually has two roles that both relate to interior immigration enforcement. It's important to understand that because that's the context in which this whole debate is occurring. So for you all, ICE is as old as the country. It's as old as your life. Like, it has always been here. But it hasn't. It's only about 15 years old. So ICE began to ramp up interior immigration operations. They started networking with police departments and sheriff's departments to increase their enforcement of immigration laws, to do more deportations, to do more raids. That kind of reached a pinnacle during the Obama administration. The Obama administration deported more people during the 8 years that Obama was president than in the entire history of the United States prior to the Obama administration. I think a lot of people don't know that because you would think Obama is a liberal president, he seems so nice, why would he be doing any of these deportations? But he did, just sort of factually. The Obama administration's policy was a dramatic ramp up in interior immigration enforcement carried out by ICE in the form of deportations and raids. In that context, in 2012, 2013, 2014, a movement started sort of on social media and at the grassroots level of activist organizations and groups called #NotOneMore. Is anyone familiar with #NotOneMore? Have you heard that before? #NotOneMore is referring to not one more deportation. So not one more person should be deported. Not one more undocumented person should be arrested by ICE and processed for deportation. Not one more. And that resistance to ICE's policies and to our immigration policies in general started to develop. The kind of seeds of the movement that you now see on television and read about in the news when you're researching immigration was planted during the Obama administration. And it didn't get as much attention as the activists would have liked, mostly because attention was paid to other things. I mean, you're spending a lot of energy, people on the left were spending a lot of energy on healthcare. They were spending a lot of energy on financial reform. They were spending a lot of energy on the back and forth with the Republicans and the constant government shutdown battles and all that kind of stuff. And so not a lot of attention was paid outside of immigrant activist circles to the deportation crisis. That brings us to Sean McElwee, and he is at the time I think he was 25, he's like 26, 27, something like that. He was a graduate student at Columbia University, and he started this like left think tank type thing, or left political organization that wanted to use data to figure out how to more effectively do left politics, and especially for like the millennial generation, or for the generation that follows, Generation Z or whatever you call yourself. He wrote an article in The Nation magazine, which is one of the prominent liberal magazines, left magazines, where he introduced this idea of abolishing ICE. And he made this argument in the context of what's called the Overton Window. And the Overton Window is a concept in political science, or political rhetoric and political communication, that defines or describes the range of acceptable or allowable, reasonable positions on a certain topic. So his contention is that from the time that the Department of Homeland Security was created, and what are you raising your hand for? I can't hear you and I can't repeat anything. It's in the document. The Overton Window, so from the time that the Department of Homeland Security was created and ICE was created, the range of acceptable arguments about immigration had grown larger and larger only on the right side of the spectrum, only on the side that was anti-immigration. So if we watch the way that immigration policies were discussed and kind of the acceptable arguments and policy ideas that were allowable in immigration policy debates from 2002 to 2008 to 2012 to 2016, we saw a steady expansion of what was an acceptable kind of mainstream, quote-unquote, immigration position on the right. So it went from generally, we want a little more border security, we want to make sure that no terrorists and organized criminals come into our country, but if you are not committing a crime, we definitely don't want to deport you, to we do need to pay more attention to even people who aren't committing crimes, we've got to make sure we're enforcing our immigration laws, but let's make a deal, let's provide more of a pathway to citizenship in exchange for some border security. Two, we don't really want legal immigration and we want to deport more and more people. To the 2016 campaign where Trump and even some of the other Republicans were basically just saying that immigrants are bad, and that we don't want any immigrants, and that we want to deport everyone, and like very aggressive, very anti-immigrant arguments. The Overton window refers to how that process changed, and it describes that range of legitimate or mainstream arguments. And McAfee's goal was to expand it the other way, to start expanding it to the left, to start expanding the number of arguments and positions that one could take in immigration debates that push the conversation farther to the left. And this article blew up, and this article got a ton of attention. It led to the formation of an online social media campaign. It led to the formation of several activist groups, including Mi Gente. It led to spin-offs like Defund Hate, which is a campaign to try to get businesses and states and localities to stop cooperating with ICE. It led to ICE on Trial, where people are pushing to prosecute ICE agents who have committed sexual assault and who have trafficked people and who have lied and kidnapped people and separated people from their family against even the policies of ICE itself. And so it's led to this kind of ecosystem of more and more aggressive left activism related to deportation and undocumented immigration and the enforcement of immigration laws against undocumented people in the United States. This sort of came to a head in the Democratic primary in New York. Joe Crowley was the #4 House Democrat. He'd been in the Congress forever. A big-time insider, a big-time Democratic institutional candidate with a ton of money behind him. He was being challenged by Alexandria OcasioCortez, who was, I think she's 28, she's very young. She is extremely progressive. She self-identifies as a democratic socialist, and she embarked on a grassroots campaign that didn't accept any outside donations, no special interest money. She pushed for a very progressive campaign, and one of the platforms, one of the main positions that she pushed for and eventually defeated Crowley on in the Democratic primary in New York City, in Queens, was abolishing ICE. So she said, we need to abolish ICE. And Joe Crowley said, ooh, that sounds extreme. We don't need to abolish ICE. And she said, no, really, we need to abolish ICE. And she won, and it was a big deal. And she sent shockwaves throughout the political system in the run-up to the midterms. And the reason this is significant is this is a very Democratic district. She's going to win. The Democrat always wins. So she will be in the House. And her success has led a lot of other politicians to have to come to terms with whether they are going to support this idea as well. So Kirsten Gillibrand from New York, the senator, was the first senator to come out in favor of abolishing ICE. Several other prominent senators decided not to, including Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris from California. And all Democratic candidates are now having to cope with the idea of, do we support abolish ICE? Should that be our platform? Or do we oppose that and try to make more reformist arguments or more moderate arguments? And it's an important political battle. But this all stems from the early Obama administration era grassroots activism against ICE, to Sean McAfee's introduction of this idea of abolishing ICE, to the subsequent activism that all kind of won a House seat against the #4 Democrat in the House. So it's a very significant thing. Which leads to what is happening currently. There's a bill called the Establishing a Humane Immigration Enforcement System Act, which was written by Mark Pocan, a House member from Wisconsin, along with 2 co-authors, and it abolishes ICE. So they actually wrote a bill in the House, they introduced it to abolish ICE. And the Republicans said, okay, let's vote it. Let's put it on the floor, we'll take a vote. And then a lot of the Democrats were like, let's not. We didn't think you were going to say that. And so this is currently happening. This is the news story now in the Congress. The Republicans think that Democrats who are embracing this position are compromising their midterm chances, that they are alienating moderate voters, that they are putting themselves behind an 8-ball by appealing to their base, but at the expense of independents and moderates and potential swing Republican voters. And so they want to make all the Democrats go on record about whether they support abolishing ICE or not. But the counter-argument that a lot of Democratic politicians, including Gillibrand and some others, have arrived at is that actually it's more beneficial to the Democrats' midterm chances if they have a kind of positive vision and a more clear and line in the sand, where they say it's unacceptable what is going on, that the things that ICE is doing have to stop. ICE itself has to stop. This is an evil organization, and this deportation stuff has to end. The family separation stuff has to end. And so that is the current political moment. The last thing I put there, #7, abolish ICE has therefore kind of become 2 things. It has become still an activist demand, so a thing, an idea and an argument that leftist activists and social progressives can rally around and use as a focal point for their activism on a wide range of immigration and migration issues, mostly about protecting undocumented people in the United States. But it's also become an actual practical political demand. So people really do just think that this agency that was created in 2003 should be ended. So they do think that there should be no more ICE. And so it is both a practical, kind of tangible, achievable political thing, and a larger thing, more of a focus of a social movement and the focus of a activist platform.
Like when I was last year.
We will skip down to what the AF argues. So, what the AF argues, in this case, the AF is defending Abolish ICE, the Abolish ICE movement. The first thing the AF argues is that what ICE is currently doing is ethnic cleansing. So, ICE is deporting people on purpose to try to cleanse the country of brown people. And that is not accidental, it is not just incidental, that is what they're doing, that is their mission explicitly. Their mission is to convince undocumented immigrants to leave, either because they have made them leave by deporting them, or they have scared them into leaving themselves, or they have deterred people from even coming to the United States in the first place. So the affirmative takes that's a strong claim, right? That's a very strong claim. The idea that there is an ethnic cleanse occurring now in the United States, that is a strong claim, but that is what a large subset of undocumented immigration activists believe. So the affirmative makes that argument. The second thing the affirmative says is that ICE itself is a structurally racist institution. That the creation of ICE was an instantiation or a solidification of white supremacist values. So remember, this happened after 9/11. Before this, immigration was not considered really a national security issue. It was more of a labor issue, a human rights issue, a community issue, a fiscal issue. It wasn't a national security issue. But on 9/11, foreigners attacked the United States. Many Americans died. And in response, the Department of Homeland Security was constructed, and all of this stuff that before wasn't considered a national security issue got folded into that. And so immigration became a national security issue. Immigrants became national security threats. Immigrants became equated with terrorists. And we've seen since then that the logical kind of endpoint of that is the Trump administration's the rhetoric about immigration. It's the way that those on the right now talk about immigrants. That kind of began right after 9/11 in this very fear-based, politically charged time when immigration stopped being a human rights issue and a social issue and an economic issue. It started to become a national security issue, an issue of crime and terrorism and safety and that kind of thing. The third thing they say is that deportation is immoral. And this is something that the Abolish ICE people intentionally want to make a legitimate argument. That used to be a legitimate part of the argument. That used to be within the Overton window of immigration policy debates. It stopped being within the Overton window of legitimate immigration policy debates for most of the time between 9/11 and now. You could get away with saying, we shouldn't deport innocent people or people who've done nothing wrong, but you couldn't really say no one should be deported. Deportation is wrong. Deportation is unethical. Deportation is evil. And part of the Abolish ICE claim is that deportation, next to just killing someone, is the very worst thing that could happen to someone. It's the worst thing that you could do to someone. And I think they have a point. If you imagine you come home from debate camp and you arrive at your door and there's police officers at your door and they say, all right, this member of your family is going to jail. This member of your family is going to a country thousands of miles away. You two kids, you're being split up. You're going to this foster house. You're going to this foster house. You'll never see each other again. Welcome home, right? That is a horrible thing to have happen. And that is literally what ICE does. That is their job. Their job is to locate undocumented immigrants. And if anyone is undocumented, they break up the family and they send the undocumented people either to prison if they are criminals or back to whatever country they came from if they are just undocumented. And that often leaves ravaged families. It destroys entire family networks. And that is their job. And under the Trump administration, even under the Obama administration, but especially under the Trump administration, they have sort of done that with zeal. They have done that with the explicit intent to terrorize and terrify undocumented people with the idea being maybe undocumented people will just leave the country because they're so afraid that they're going to get rounded up. Maybe they'll just decide, all right, we got to move the family intact back to Mexico or back to Guatemala or whatever, because otherwise ICE is coming for us. The fourth argument they say is that Trump's ICE policies, while very bad, are not that exceptional. If we look at the full spectrum of American immigration history, we see that it was founded by the Chinese Exclusion Act. It continued to be a tool to manage the population, to ensure that white people remain the majority, and to serve the interests of the white majority in the United States. And the Trump administration is not any different than the rest of the history of U.S. immigration policy. It is a continuation, it is a logical extension, it is not a unique thing. And so a lot of people on the left, a lot of Democrats who are less to the left will say, oh, we got to stop Trump, we got to resist Trump, or the resistance. Trump is really bad, he's an authoritarian, he's a fascist. If only he wasn't the president, then this wouldn't be a problem anymore. But from the Abolish ICE perspective, that's a bad argument, because during the Obama administration, deportations were very similar. ICE's policies were very similar. And so their argument is that it's not just Trump, it's the whole system of immigration enforcement and interior enforcement of immigration laws that is the problem. You have a question. What is your question?
Is abolishing ICE politically feasible?
That is not the kind of question that you need to ask right now. I'm doing my thing. Okay. Number 5. In fact, number 5. Abolish ICE is both a practical demand and an act of radical imagination. Okay? So like I said before, abolish ICE has kind of become two things. It's become a political proposal, like an actual thing that could be enacted. There's a bill in the House that would do this. It definitely doesn't have the votes right now, but it's not unthinkable that this agency could be closed. One of the reasons that it might be politically feasible is that it uses or leverages a lot of Republican opposition to big government and bureaucracy and wastefulness and inefficiency. Many of the things that Republicans tend to say about bloated government agencies, the Democrats can say about ICE. ICE, it didn't need to exist. We were fine before it. It's only 15 years old. It's very wasteful. It has a lot of overlapping responsibilities. It'd be better if we simplify and we reduce government bureaucracy. So in some ways, it is a practical political demand. But more importantly, in another way, it is a platform or an idea that creates a vision for a different kind of America and a different kind of world. A world that doesn't enforce immigration laws, that doesn't distinguish between legal and illegal immigrants, that provides liberation for migrants of all kinds, that challenges the securitization and the treatment of immigrants as threats and as terrorists and as national security problems and as others that need to be managed and excluded to preserve our way of life and that kind of thing. So number 6. Abolishing ICE is a starting point for a broader movement for immigrant or migrant liberation. The affirmative says that adopting this demand and centering our immigration politics on this demand is valuable because this is the way that we can interface with a larger vision for what a just world would look like. It's a world without deportation. It's a world without closed borders. It's a world without exploitation of labor. It's a world without exploitation of the third world or of the global south. It's a world without exploitation of anyone. That's the kind of ultimate vision. And they see the abolition of ICE as a way to make that vision both tangible and inspiring for a long-term vision of how to make things better, how to make the world better. The final argument that they make, that the AF makes, is that political compromises over immigration policy are unacceptable, and that's why we have gotten into the situation we've gotten into. So the affirmative's argument is that the pursuit of bipartisan immigration reform, the constant search for compromise, trading this for that, trading the DREAM Act for more border security, trading an increase in legal visas for high-skilled workers, for funding for the wall, trading an increase in ICE's budget for an increase in the number of refugees that we accept. That whole political game solidifies the immigration system as it exists, an immigration system that is designed to purge non-white people from the United States. An immigration system that is designed to terrify and terrorize undocumented people by distinguishing between legal and illegal, by managing the migration of people from the global south to the United States. And so the affirmative's argument is that there can be no compromise. ICE can't be reformed, ICE can't be negotiated for some other deal. We just have to uncompromisingly demand that ICE end and that deportations end. Hashtag abolish ICE, hashtag not one more, etc. So, what can the negative say? The first thing the negative can say is topicality. And there are going to be a lot of different ways that affirmatives will interface with abolish ICE. So in this starter packet, I kind of intentionally designed a plan that is between a plan and not a plan. So the affirmative says, we demand abolishment of ICE. And so you will immediately look at it, and a lot of you will be like, all right, is that a plan? Is that not a plan? Is that topical? Is that not topical? Well, the affirmative thinks that it's topical. The affirmative thinks that abolishing ICE reduces a United States federal government restriction on legal immigration. And the affirmative has some evidence that says that the very existence of ICE as a domestic interior immigration enforcement agency deters people from utilizing the legal immigration system. It gives examples where people stop going to get green cards because they're afraid that when they are at the green card office that they will be detained and deported by ICE. So the affirmative thinks that this is topical. Obviously, the only entity that could abolish ICE is the United States federal government. So the affirmative will say that they're topical. But the negative can say that that isn't topical, either because that's not a reduction in restrictions on legal immigration, maybe it's extra topical, maybe it goes beyond the scope of the resolution. There's a lot of different topicality arguments that you can potentially make, and I'm sure as you start thinking about how to debate this, you'll have other ideas. Looking forward, I think affirmatives will probably radicalize this affirmative more. The reason the starter package is not more radical is I think it facilitates some good and interesting debates about some of these other arguments, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I think during the season, a lot of teams might take a more radical position. They'll connect the Abolish ICE movement more to the components about capitalism, or the components about settler colonialism. There's a 1AC card from the California Youth Immigration League, or I think I missed one of the words, but it's some serious words that are like that. That makes that connection. It draws the connection between the Abolish ICE movement and capitalism, the Abolish ICE movement and settler colonialism, the Abolish ICE movement and North-South relations, and the manipulation of the global South, globalization, that kind of thing. I think affirmatives will try to push more in that direction. The more the affirmative moves in that direction, the more topicality arguments the negative has access to. At the same time, I think some affirmatives will move even closer to a topical plan. They might just say the United States federal government should abolish ICE. They might say the United States federal government should cease interior immigration enforcement, something like that. And those would invite different topicality arguments. But certainly, abolish ICE on its own is not directly topical, but it sure is very close, and it's definitely something that interfaces or intersects with many of the issues that you will be debating this year. So what the DREAM Act and Abolish ICE are very connected. A lot of the activists that are associated with Abolish ICE are also dreamers or dreamer activists. Same thing with refugees and asylum seekers and family separation. All of these issues, it's hard, like when you're doing the research and when you're learning about them, you won't be able to avoid the Abolish ICE debate. The second thing the negatives can say is that ICE shouldn't be abolished, it should be changed. And there are a lot of ways that ICE could be changed. This is the response you'll see if you do some research and read about what mainstream Democrats, kind of moderate Democrats or institutional Democrats think about this, and what even some Republicans think. They say, all right, you got a point, maybe ICE has gotten a little overboard during the Trump administration, but here are some changes that we can make. So let's not abolish it, let's make some changes. The specific one in your file would get rid of the ERO component of ICE, the component that does enforcement and removal, so the deportation police force. But keep around this HSI component. Keep around the Homeland Security investigations. And the negative has an argument that those investigations are important because they can stop trafficking. And they have empirically uncovered and prosecuted and shut down trafficking rings and child pornography rings and other criminal enterprises. Those aren't the only reforms that could happen. There are other reforms, there are other arguments that you could make about why it's important that there be an interior immigration enforcement. You could read other disadvantages based on allowing undocumented immigrants to live in the United States. So you could read your Green Sustainability DA, you could read a Wages DA, you could read a Remittances DA, you could read any kind of disadvantage that is premised upon ICE no longer enforcing immigration laws and no longer deterring undocumented immigration. The third thing that negatives can say is the midterm sysad. And this is sort of the reason that I think this file is useful to debate and useful to learn about. The negative will make the argument that the Abolish ICE demand cedes the political, cedes politics, cedes immigration politics to the right. That it helps Republicans win immigration debates. And that is what Trump has said about Abolish ICE. That is what Paul Ryan has said about Abolish ICE. That is what Mitch McConnell has said about Abolish ICE. That is what some Democrats, including members of the Obama administration, have said about Abolish ICE. They have said, I see, activists, you've said that there is an ethnic cleansing occurring. You've said that ICE is out of control and that it's breaking up families and that we basically have a white supremacist, genocidal police force running rampage over our country. But don't be so extreme. That's way too extreme. If you make those arguments, you will turn off a significant portion of the electorate. A significant portion of the electorate that might be considering voting for you, but might also be considering voting for Republicans. So all you're doing, OcasioCortez or Gillibrand or others, is making it easier for Trump to win re-election in 2020, making it easier for the Republicans to keep control of the House and toss up Senate seats in 2018. The affirmative disagrees with that strongly, and there is an interesting back and forth about who is right. So the negative says that compromise is good, that yes, that requires accepting that you don't get everything you want in the first place. It requires giving Republicans some of what they want in order to appeal to their voters and in order to get an actual deal done. So it might require enacting the DREAM Act and reducing some ICE enforcement, but also spending more on the Border Patrol and spending a little on the border wall or something like that. It might require accepting some cuts in legal immigration in exchange for some cuts to the ICE budget or some constraints on ICE operations. But that's good, the negative says. That's the only way to actually change immigration policy. The affirmative says that that's why Democrats keep losing, because Republicans have a grandiose, overarching, not complicated, simple, and kind of cathartic, ethos-y, pathos-y vision for immigration. That vision is immigrants are scary, they're trying to take your jobs and kill you. and they're trying to ruin our way of life. And so we have to be a nation of laws, and we have to invest in our border. What is a country without its borders? It's not even a country. Very easy to understand. Not a lot of policy details. The people in the F group, the people that support the Abolish ICE movement, think that the left needs the same kind of thing. The left needs a principled position, and that principled position can win elections. And the only reason that mainstream Democrats think it's not going to win elections is because they are only thinking about demographics and groups of potential voters that they already have in their pocket. They're not thinking about all of the potential voters that they could attract if they actually gave people a reason to show up and something to believe in and a powerful vision of social change. Just like OcasioCortez did in New York in an election where probably outspent her by like 15 times or something like that, where no one thought she was going to win, where she had a small operation and she just, basically just walked around and met people and had a bunch of young people volunteering for her and connected with voters, and she won. And that happened in New York. A lot of people say, well, that couldn't happen in other places, but from the ACT perspective, it could, but Democrats need to try. And so as activists, we have to push Democrats and push the people on the left to adopt that position and to be that clear about no more deportations, about no more ICE, about no more ethnic cleansing, about no, line in the sand, no compromising with the Republicans, no compromising with Trump's positions on immigration. So the negative can read the midterms DA, they can also just read a C, the political DA, they can make arguments about why the ASS strategy is bad. And that's a net benefit to a reform-oriented strategy. It's a net benefit to a compromise-oriented strategy. The affirmative will impact turn, link turn, have a bunch of arguments answering that position. Next, I sort of already said this, but the negative can say that immigration enforcement is good. The affirmative ultimately desires open borders, even if it doesn't practically result in open borders immediately. And so the negative can say that that's a bad thing to want. That's a bad thing to want for economic reasons. That's a bad thing to want for political reasons. That's a bad thing to want for environmental reasons. That's a bad thing to want for social or cultural reasons. So the negative can say that this vision that the Abolish ICE folks have, this vision that the affirmative has, is an undesirable vision. It's the kind of vision that we don't want. We instead have a different vision for immigration. Often that could be a net benefit to the counterpart. And finally, the negative can critique Abolish ICE even farther from the left. So they could issue a settler colonialism critique of Abolish ICE. There's a card in the 1AC that tries to kind of make the two compatible, but certainly an aggressive settler colonialism negative argument would link to Abolish ICE. So might an aggressive anti-blackness argument or Afro-pessimism argument. Abolish ICE is talking about undocumented immigrants, and it's talking about this vision where migrants have free movement, but it's not talking about the way that undocumented immigrants benefit from a social and economic order that was built on slave labor. They're not talking about that. They're not talking about how the sort of migrant justice and their vision of immigrant justice is dichotomized or built on understandings of humanness and belonging that are anti-black. Or that, in settler colonialism example, that rely on segmenting out ownership of stolen land, that allow more people to live in a place that was stolen and live on land that was stolen. So they can make arguments that are even farther from the left. Now, in order to debate all of this stuff, you need to be familiar with the history. So go back up to the document to U.S. immigration policies you need to know to debate this case. And you can learn a lot of this just by reading the 1AC card. And I'll highlight a few of the important ones, but we don't have much time left. So the first immigration policy that the United States enacted was the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, and it literally just banned Chinese people from coming to the United States. Prior to that, there wasn't really an immigration policy. The Geary Act, 10 years later, noted pro-slavery Senator Geary, cemented that into law 10 years later, and that kind of created our modern immigration system. That law was challenged in the Supreme Court, and in this very famous landmark case a year later in 1893, Fong Yu Ting v. United States, the Supreme Court said Chinese Exclusion Act is fine. The Geary Act is fine. It is the purview of the elected branches of the United States federal government to decide who gets to come in and who doesn't into our country. And that is the foundation of the Supreme Court's recent travel ban decision. That is the foundation of plenary power. The idea that the political branches, the president and the Congress, have unmitigated authority over immigration policy. That immigrants basically have no rights. They only have the rights that are granted to them by the elected branches. And so that then, from 1892, 1893, there's a through line all the way to just last month when Justice Roberts and the Roberts Court in a 5-4 majority said that the travel ban is constitutional because even if it seems like the president has racial animus or has religious animus behind it, we can't prove that, and we have to just defer to the president. It is the president's decision how we are going to design our immigration system, even if the president says no Muslims, even if the president says no brown people, no black people, no people from whatever country. It's not the court's role to step in. Immigration policy gradually changed. You can read about some of the specifics. So from 1917 to 1924 and 1929, gradually more and more restrictions were made to exclude particular populations from the United States and to maintain the majority stake in power. So to maintain political control in already favored groups. So the groups that were in power designed an immigration system that kept them in power by controlling who was admitted and who was not. The Chinese Exclusion Act was finally repealed in 1943. It's a really long time for it to have been enforced. The Immigration and Nationality Act in 1952, that's kind of the controlling current statute that decides immigration policy in the United States. You'll probably read topicality definitions from that. You'll probably read it and hear that mentioned in all sorts of different apps that you're debating, because that's sort of the one that has all of our current immigration laws in it. That's eventually updated in 1965. 1986 is a really interesting one. That's during the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration provided amnesty to about 2 million illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants in the United States, which for many of you who have grown up in, have only reached kind of teenage consciousness in the last few years, I think you would probably find that remarkable. So Ronald Reagan, the hero of the Republican Party, Trump loves Ronald Reagan. The signature policy in 1986 during the Reagan administration on immigration was actually to provide amnesty for lots and lots of undocumented immigrants. And Reagan's argument was, we have to enforce our laws, but they haven't done anything wrong. Maybe they came here, they made a mistake, but they've been living here peacefully. They haven't been breaking the law. They're pillars of our community, and so we certainly shouldn't deport them. We should allow them to stay permanently. The 1990s roll around, and Bill Clinton is the president. And you would think, okay, Democrats, they like immigration, but actually, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, which I believe is pronounced IRA, I'm not sure. You can look it up on YouTube. Is one of, if not the most restrictive immigration policies for undocumented immigrants that we have ever passed. So the Clinton administration thought that they needed to demonstrate their credibility on crime and prove that they were tough. So they passed this law that substantially increased restrictions on undocumented immigrants, that kind of set the stage for what would later happen when ICE was created and the policies of the Obama administration and the Trump administration. You can read more about that. It's fascinating. That brings us all the way back to the place we started this. The Homeland Security Act of 2002 creates ICE, Operation Streamline, the Department of Homeland Security policy. You can read about that. That's also part and parcel of how ICE and the Border Patrol have expanded their operations over the last decade, or really 2 decades. We're coming up on 2 decades now. And that gets us to the Trump administration. But from the AFT perspective, to really understand the AFT's argument, this is all one long narrative, and it shares a lot in common. There's kind of changes in exactly who is allowed, but undergirding the whole system, undergirding the whole immigration set of policies in the United States is this faith in white supremacy, this belief in white supremacy, and the belief that undocumented immigrants, illegal immigrants are distinct from legal immigrants, and by deciding who's legal and who's illegal, the government can manage the population to maintain the power and control of white people, of privileged, dominant groups. And the Trump administration has amplified the already extreme deportation procedures that Obama had ICE do. And now ICE is engaged in more raids and more deportations than ever before. It is entangled with all sorts of law enforcement agencies, and we basically just have a national police force, a militarized, weaponized police force, whose only job is to ferret out people who are undocumented, terrorize them, and kick them out of the country. And so from the affirmative perspective, that is an intolerable set of things, that's an intolerable situation, that is an intolerable agency, that is an intolerable mission, that is something that people of conscience cannot tolerate. And so the affirmative says we should endorse abolish ICE. We should demand the abolition of ICE. We should affirm that as a practical political demand, as well as vision for a different type of immigration politics. And the negative has a variety of options, as we've said. But the reason that this debate is so interesting is that it really gets at something that you're going to be debating all the time this year, in critique debates and in policy or plan debates, which is how extreme do we need to make the reforms? How much can we tolerate the status quo? How aggressive do we need to issue our reforms? Is the current system even salvageable, or do we need a whole different system? How radical do we need to be in our demands for change or in our proposals for change? If we are too radical, are there costs to that? If we're not radical enough, are there costs to that? And that debate, if you have that debate, using this starter set, we'll add some more stuff as we go, I think will really prepare you to have a wide range of debates that aren't necessarily about abolish ICE, but that you can draw parallels to. A lot of critique affirmatives, you can say, well, that critique affirmative, or like, not being topical or not defending a plan, that reminds me of the abolish ICE movement. And here's my argument about why the abolish ICE movement is a loser for the left. Here's my argument about why the abolish ICE movement is ineffective. And on the opposite side, you might be able to draw parallels between abolish ICE and something that you're defending. So I think, my critique alternative, or my plan, or my policy idea, or whatever, that reminds me, or strikes me as analogous to abolish ICE. And here's my set of arguments about why abolish ICE is an effective platform for change, an effective demand for change, an effective way to mobilize change and expand the scope of acceptable immigration policies, pushing immigration policy to the left. And so I would encourage you to spend some time learning the arguments, spend some time reading these articles at the top to kind of familiarize yourself with this, and then pay attention to see how this plays out. I don't know how this is going to play out. It's not clear whether they're going to have the vote in the House. It's not clear how this is going to play out in November, but a lot of smart people are thinking about this right now. So I think it's a really cool time to be having this conversation in debates and to be able to play with these arguments and kind of think through what you think, because ultimately it's your generation that's going to have to fix the immigration system. I'm too old already. You all are going to have to figure it out. And the abolish ICE movement is largely composed of people of your generation or slightly older, college-age students. McElwee was 25 or 26. And so I think it's a cool thing to get to debate. So I hope that you have fun with it, and I hope that you learn something from debating.